Have you ever prayed a prayer of panic before? This could be like right before a test that you had not studied for. Anyone prayed one of those? Or maybe like you've been speeding and then those lights turn on behind you. Anyone prayed one of those before? Yeah, you're cheering a little loud for that. I remember before we had kids, my wife and I would take a road trip around Lake Michigan, and there was an area in Michigan I really wanted to take her called Pictured Rocks. And it was a quick road trip, and when we got to the Pictured Rocks, this like storm had rolled in, and they had canceled all of the boats and all of the rentals. There was this thick fog, and Lake Superior was not a happy camper. And we only had a day in this place, and I was really bummed that all of these tours had been canceled until I found some crazy person at a dock that I think was mildly drunk at 11 a.m. offered me the keys to his pontoon boat. And of course I said, what's the worst that could happen? Foreshadowing, just kidding. So he tosses me the keys, mumbles something that I couldn't understand, and Katie and I hop on this pontoon boat because I want to take her to this island off the Pictured Rocks to impress this woman that I loved. And we begin driving into this fog, and about 15 minutes in, now all I can see is fog, and I'm not quite sure I'm going the right direction. And externally, I'm very confident. Internally, I'm praying a prayer of panic. Does anyone know that feeling? Like I'm putting on a front right now. I have a strong game face, but internally, and we finally found the island, thank God. And then on our way back, actually, a rescue boat intercepted us and said, "You're not supposed to be out here." There's something about panic, about desperation, that leads us to prayer, but why does it take that? Why does it take these moments of panic or desperation when the bottom drops out? Prayer is supposed to be a gift, and yet for many of us, it feels more like a burden, or at least confusing, or an obligation. If prayer feels difficult for you, you're not alone. Luke 11 shows us that we're not alone in this struggle. Luke 11 verse 1, it says, "One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, 'Lord, teach us to pray.'" Now, it's worth noting that these men knew how to pray already. They were a part of a context and a time, but they already knew how to pray. Only one time in the Gospels do the disciples ask Jesus to teach them something. And they could have asked for anything, by the way. They could have said, "Teach us how to preach, teach us how to lead, teach us how to run an organization. Teach us that walking on water thing, that's pretty sick. Teach us the multiplying food thing, that will probably come in handy." The one time they ask him to teach us to pray. The fact that they asked means that even the people walking closest to Jesus weren't quite sure how to do it. Isn't that comforting? If you find prayer clunky or confusing or burdensome, even the disciples had questions. Even they feel like they needed help. But they saw something different in how Jesus prayed. They saw it modeled. In Luke 5, it says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." He was regularly retreating from the demands of his time. As his popularity grew, he was regularly stepping back to be in intimacy with the Father. The one person who was qualified to have a Messiah complex doesn't seem to have one. Was very comfortable saying, "No, my dance card is full. I have to go be alone with the Father." It was a profound priority for Jesus, and the disciples noticed. It reminds me of the counterintuitive words from Martin Luther, who once said, "I have so much to do that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer." I'll be really honest, that is not usually my first instinct. If I look at my agenda, my to-do list, and it's overwhelming, I don't think, boy, I better carve out 3 hours of prayer. But the disciples, men and women like Luther, understood something that I think I often miss. Now, a lot of us, my guess is, have made New Year's resolutions. Anyone broken their New Year's resolution already? Anyone, like, "I'm going to the gym 47 times a day." Psych. My guess is, for some of us, prayer is maybe on that list. And if we're honest, prayer is sometimes kind of jammed into, 45 seconds after I wake up, or during a commercial break of a TV show, or seconds before a meal. You ever had a meal sitting in front of you and then you have a long-winded prayer at the table and you're wafting the lasagna and you're like, "Can we wrap it up with the Latin? We don't need to keep doing this." The truth is, when it comes to teaching on prayer, it can be awkward, at least for me, because it's something that I feel like most of us know we should be doing, but are frustrated we don't. There's nothing that I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes that'll make you go, "Oh, I should pray. just so we can get this out at the onset, there will be no drive-by guilting today. No, you really should be doing this. In fact, in a study of 7,500 Christians in the US, 51% aged 18 to 30 expressed dissatisfaction with their prayer lives. In fact, a different study, they found that only 16% of Protestant pastors were satisfied with their prayer lives. If you're frustrated with your prayer life, you are not alone. So no drive-by guilting today, telling you what you already know. But if the disciples saw prayer as the thing they wanted Jesus to teach them, that seems like a good place to start. I think I agree with the words from Charles Spurgeon, who said, I would rather teach one man to pray than 10 men to preach. So that's where we're going for this series, for the next few weeks together, because personally, I have been feeling this burden for our church for about the last 6 months or so. A burden for us to not just simply pray, but to be a church of prayer, to be a people of prayer, to step into spaces where if God doesn't show up, we're gonna look like idiots. To practice a little holy foolishness, and that will require for us to be a people of prayer, dependent on God every step of the way. So in this series, we're gonna explore what it means to pray with honesty and boldness by looking at how Jesus taught his disciples to pray. We're gonna walk line by line through what's become known as the Lord's Prayer, not to master a skill, but to grow in relationship with God. So whether you're just starting out or longing for deeper intimacy with God, this series will help you take a next step. Now, we've already mentioned it, but again, bridge.tv/prayer, there's a whole lot of resources there for you, and there's books and podcasts and journals. But one thing I do wanna highlight and implore you to take advantage of is for the duration of this series on Tuesdays and Thursdays from noon to 1 in our Spring Hill Auditorium, we're having what's called the prayer room. And I highly recommend, at some point in the next 5 weeks, carve out an hour just to experience what that's like. What would that look like for us to see this place more like a boiler room where the Lord is preparing us to head out into a world to bring the light of the gospel wherever he might have us. Now, regardless, this simple request from the disciples, teach us to pray, is at the heart of our series. Now, in Luke 11, there's a shorter version of the Lord's Prayer, but Matthew 6 actually has the longer one, and we'll be exploring that one for our series. So today we're gonna read the 4 verses actually right before the Lord's Prayer and begin walking through the Lord's Prayer next week. Here, Jesus teaches us not just how to pray, but how not to pray, and he's gonna contrast 2 common pitfalls. So let me read all 4 verses, and then we'll walk through each verse line by line. Matthew 6, verse 5. It says, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So a little bit of context. In the verses right before this, Jesus has been warning about not making a show of our generosity. And part of what he's doing here in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, he's calling us beyond our present reality to a coming kingdom. So I want to make 4 observations from these 4 verses as we kind of begin this prayer journey as a church together. Number 1, presence over performance. Presence over performance. Verse 5 again. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. Now, right off the bat, some of us are thinking, whew, easy peasy, because I only pray in street corners every other month, so it's not that big of a temptation, right? It's easy to kind of let ourselves off the hook here, but as Jesus often does, he's speaking to something much deeper. There's a Jewish practice to pray 3 times a day wherever you were, and there's actually a rabbinic rule to not pray loudly, because there are lots of opportunities for performative prayers. The issue is not about standing, and it's not about street corners. It's less about where our body is and more about where our heart is. I just read this article this week. There's a product that is selling for $15 a can called Spray on Mud, and it's for people who own off-road vehicles but live in the city. So you can spray on mud so it appears like you've been trekking in the wild. In fact, a business consultant who markets the product said this: With spray-on mud, they can make it look like they've been off-road instead of just driving to shops and back. People want to look like they've been off-road, but they certainly don't want any chips or scratches on the paintwork while they're doing the school run. This is part of what Jesus is warning about. Don't make your prayer life spray on mud that makes it look like you've been in the trenches, like you've been doing the work just to simply be seen by others. Prayer is not a performance. Jesus isn't mad that they're praying. Public prayers aren't even bad. Some of the most meaningful moments of my life have been someone praying publicly over me. He's getting at their motivation for doing so. And then he says the reward they get is whatever they get. It's cheap, it's small, it's short-lived. Applause for being so spiritual. Now again, we've talked about this. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek theater and it refers to an actor wearing a mask. Some commentators argue that it wasn't even necessarily a derogatory term. It was just a matter of fact. Oh, hypocrite, someone who wears a mask. Part of what Jesus is saying is don't wear a mask in your prayer life. Don't put on a performance, especially not for an audience of people. This is a challenge that isn't limited just to ancient times. We might not stand on street corners, but many of us still struggle with performative prayer. Maybe it's in a small group where we're tempted to use more eloquent words to sound more spiritual. Maybe it's in private when we subconsciously try to impress God with the sophistication of our prayers. Jesus says that's not what prayer is about. Next verse, privacy over publicity. Privacy over publicity, verse 6. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. For you claustrophobics, I think close the door is hyperbolic here, just so you know. Essentially what he's getting at here is go somewhere private. Like in any relationship, intimacy is built with one-on-one time in private. Just to say it like this, it would be strange if you only talk to your spouse in public. Would you agree? If the only time you ever talked to them was around other people, I don't think that'd be a very healthy marriage. Now, the Greek word for room here is the word tamion, and refers to an inner storage closet, small, humble, and unseen. In this place, distractions fade, and the temptation to perform disappears. It's just you and God. Maybe the challenge for you this week is just to find a place like that, where it's just you and God. The bottom line here is that God values authenticity over visibility. And here's the promise. The promise is your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. I've never really thought about this. That part seems odd to me because the right motivation is still about a reward. Like we love altruism in the West. Notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, pray like this because it's the right thing to do. Because look at all that God did for you. This is the least you could do. Now, he also doesn't say what the reward is, so don't fill in the blank. But my guess is that the reward is something like the joy of being fully known and fully loved by God. He will reward you when we choose to stop performing and simply be with him. And then number 3, honesty over hype. Honesty over hype. Verse 7 again. When you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Now, the word pagan here is essentially anyone who doesn't worship Yahweh, the one true God. And in the ancient world, pagans believed that their gods could be like manipulated or coerced through repetition, through these like formulaic prayers. The longer the prayer, the more likely they thought that their gods would actually respond to them. It's sort of like any Office fans. This is one of my favorite Michael Scott quotes of all time. He said, sometimes I start a sentence and I don't even know where it's going. It's sort of that idea. Like I'm just sort of shocked. It's like if you ever you're writing a paper and you have a word count to hit. You've ever like added extra long sentences just to try to hit the word count. Like can't goes to I cannot, and then goes to I henceforth am unable to can, and you're like, okay, we're not saying anything. In prayer, we often tend to do this. Just a moment of confession. Has anyone ever prayed for a hedge of protection? Like the devil's biggest obstacle is shrubbery. Like we're all like just. You ever said like traveling mercies? And you're like, I don't even know what those are. Why am I praying that God bless the hands that prepared it, not the whole person, just the hands? You ever pray? This one's my favorite. When you pray that this food would be nourishing to our bodies as we were about to down a Big Mac. Anyone ever had that? You're like, please turn this into broccoli somewhere on the way down. We're just sort of tossing up weights, like what we're used to saying. In fact, the pagan rule of thumb is you need to find a way to illustrate how sincere you are. This is through babbling. This would also be through screaming or repetition, sometimes ripping their clothes. These acts were seen like a spiritual flare gun to get their gods to pay attention because their gods were distant and indifferent. But Jesus reveals that the true God is not like that. He's not distant, he's near. He's not indifferent, he's kind. And yet, so often we fall into the same trap. We treat prayer like it's a transaction, thinking if I say the right words, maybe God will give me what I want. We worry about getting the formula right, forgetting that prayer is not about perfection, it's about presence. I would say it like this: God is way more interested in your sincerity than your stage presence. Just be honest with him. God meets us where we are, not where we pretend to be. The invitation of Jesus is to pray honestly, trusting that God hears us, not because we've said the right words, but because he loves us. Maybe a diagnostic question to ask this week is, do my prayers in private and public sound anything alike? I remember when I graduated undergrad and all of my friends were kind of becoming pastors and we'd go to different churches to support them, especially when they gave their first sermon. And I realized something was happening is that all of my buddies, and myself included, we had this like preacher voice. You know what I'm talking about? Hopefully I'm not doing it right now, but maybe. And we would go to like support them, and afterwards we're like, who is that guy up there? I don't even recognize how that person talks. Don't we sometimes do that in prayer? Or we toss up these words in the hopes that it will impress God, forgetting that he's a father who loves us. And then number 4, trust over technique. Trust over technique. Verse 8, do not be like them, for your father knows what you need before you ask him. Jesus says, don't be like that. I can almost picture him like maybe even raising his voice a little bit as he says it. Don't be like that. That's not what prayer is, because God is not distant or disinterested. Think about that for a moment. God doesn't need our prayers to inform him of anything. We are never catching him up or filling him in. Prayer is not about convincing or manipulating God. It's about connecting with him. When we pray, we're not trying to earn his attention. We're aligning our hearts with his. Jesus is not saying, by the way, can you stop asking over and over again? I'm getting a little annoyed. In fact, in a couple of chapters later, he's going to say we should continue to ask, to pursue. God is eager to hear from us. And I'll be really honest, I've struggled most of my life to really believe that. That God is eager to hear from us. That prayer is an invitation. I have believed that I am a burden to God, like an unwanted house guest in God's home. And here's what I've found to be true, is that help can be a prayer, ugh can be a prayer, thank you can be a prayer, wow can be a prayer, tears can be a prayer. Worry less about having the right words or the right formula and just bring your honest, true self to him. Because he is a loving father who longs for relationship with us. John Ropeberg says it like this. He says, it's better to be an honest mess before God than a dishonest saint. It's way better to be an honest, God, this is what I have in this moment. This is where I'm actually at. Now, Jesus also speaks of God as Father, and we'll talk a whole lot more about this next week, but I do want to say this, that I know that for many of us, that word is very painful. The word Father does not, for you, denote protection or care, and I believe that Jesus wants to restore the word Father in your life. This is a term of intimacy, of relationship, that you are not only welcomed, but you are embraced by Dad. My kids know that they always have access to Papa. There's no meeting that I'm in that is more important than them. This is the kind of invitation that we have. More on that next week. But when we pray, that we know that we're not approaching a distant deity or an impersonal force. We're coming to a father who sees us and knows us and loves us. He's a father who wants freedom from sin in our life and the stuff that ensnares us and trips us up and draws us off course and keeps us trapped. And if you've never trusted in God in that way, let today be that day for you. To trust in the gospel of the resurrected Jesus who says, I have come to free you from sin and death and all that would ensnare you and all the things that draw you off course. This is the heart of a father. And when we understand that, it changes how we approach him in prayer. And let's be clear, this doesn't mean that we always get what we ask for. God's knowledge of our needs goes way beyond our immediate desires. And sometimes his answers come in ways we don't expect or don't understand. But we can trust that his heart is good and that his plans are for our ultimate flourishing. As Dallas Willard beautifully put it, he said, prayer is talking with God about what we are doing together. I just love that invitation. God, what are we doing together? What do you want to do in me and through me? It's not just something we do, it's a way of being with God. And yet, if we're honest, prayer can still feel really difficult, even in light of all that. I want to address briefly some of the reasons why I think we don't pray. This isn't an exhaustive list, but after 20 years of being a pastor, here's some that I see over and over and over again. Number one, we don't because we didn't. Like we already feel guilty. We haven't, so we feel guilty and we avoid it more. It's sort of like if I sent you a text and you didn't respond to it, which none of you would do, right? But let's say hypothetically. And then you like saw me in the grocery store the next day. I know that a lot of us would then be like avoiding me. You're like, oh no, I forgot the text. Like we feel that way with God sometimes. Like I haven't yet, and so I just kind of keep putting it off. And guilt fosters avoidance. Don't avoid it, just be honest. As James wrote, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Don't let guilt keep you in that space of shame any longer. I also believe that we forget that prayer is an invitation. We forget that prayer is an invitation. Have you ever had someone over to the house that didn't get the cue that like the dinner was over? You're like trying to like yawn and stretch. You're like walking to the door. You're like vacuuming around their feet. You're like, we are, some of us, we have that posture towards God. Like, sorry, I don't want to bother you. We see throughout the pages of Scripture, prayer is an invitation. God pursues us first. While we were still sinners, he came after us and says, get in here. It's an invitation from a loving Father. And number three, we often don't know where to begin. Maybe we don't feel like we measure up, or we hear other people's prayers and they're so much more eloquent. We wonder if God prefers their prayers over ours. I take so much comfort in Romans 8. It says, we do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through groaning too deep for words. If you don't have a single word, you can still come to God in prayer. If you have no way to articulate it or understand it, it can just be, here I am. I just want to be with you. Another reason I think we don't pray is we have an unhealthy fear of God. Notice I said unhealthy. There is a healthy fear of God that the Bible talks about. But for you, maybe your old man was a jerk. And the fear now is crippling. And we don't spend time with God because we're convinced that he doesn't like us. In fact, there's a part of our brain called the anterior cingulate, which is between our limbic system and our prefrontal cortex. When stimulated, it decreases our impulses of anger and fear and increases our feelings of compassion. And so when we contemplate the love of God, it literally rewires our brain, making us more compassionate and loving. But the opposite is also true. If your view of God is an angry, authoritarian tyrant in the sky, it also changes your brain and changes your brain to make you more fearful and aggressive. We need to see God as a loving Father who pursues us in our brokenness. Number five, I think we often don't think we need him. Many of us operate under the illusion of control. We just go about our lives as if we're the king of our own kingdom. And the reason I know that's not true is there's not a single one of us whose entire year wouldn't be drastically changed right now by a single text message. And yet we operate in this like false sense of control, or we feel like we're holier than we actually are. We decrease the seriousness of our sins and increase the seriousness of others. The truth is, many of us are dangerously close to being functional atheists. We have decent theology in our head, but anemic theology in practice. We desperately need him for every breath in our lungs. The last breath that you took is a gift. Everything this side of hell is a gift. And then number six, maybe we doubt it makes a difference. Maybe you prayed for something in the past and it didn't happen. You prayed for healing and the sickness got worse. You prayed for clarity, but the situation grew more confusing. We're actually going to talk about that in the coming weeks in this prayer series, but I want us to see that prayer is anything but passive. In fact, this might be a little intense. I actually think prayer is a declaration of war. Prayer is a declaration of war on self-sufficiency, where we realize our need for God. It's a declaration of war on independence, where we admit that we can't do it alone. It's a declaration of war on self-importance, where we praise someone greater than ourselves. It's a declaration of war on cynicism, where we step out in faith that he hears us. It's a declaration of war on works-based righteousness, where we recognize it's God who works in us. It's a gift of grace. It's It's a declaration of war on a frantic pace of life where we take time amidst the noise to be still with God, Prayer is rebellion against the ever-present and ever-increasing tyranny of noise and distraction. It is a declaration of war on self-centered short-term living. I would say it like this: in an age of information whiplash, prayer is the neck brace. There are a lot of things screaming for our attention, telling us what is true. And in an age of information whiplash, prayer is the neck brace. I think one of the most important tasks of prayer is learning to discern the voice of the Father over every other voice. So what do we do? As we kind of launch into this prayer season as a church, how do we actually take these words from Jesus seriously? How can we apply them in real, tangible ways? As I've said before, intimacy requires intentionality. Just kind of 3 suggestions as we begin this series together. Number 1, just start with simplicity. Jesus makes it really clear. Your prayers don't have to be elaborate or eloquent to be meaningful. In fact, he warns against piling up words to try and impress God. Just start honestly, simply. You might say, God, I don't even know what to say, but I want to spend time with you. Number 2, shift your audience. Ask yourself, who am I praying to? If you find yourself trying to impress others around you or even God, remember, you are speaking to a Father who already loves you. Set aside time each day just to simply pray in private. Find a quiet spot where you won't be distracted. Start small. If silence feels awkward, try journaling. I've told the story of my great-grandma before, and she would pray ABC prayers every morning. She would just run through the alphabet 5 or 6 times, and she'd say, Lord, thank you for air. Thank you for the birds. Thank you for my children. Thank you for my dog. Whatever, to just start simply. Hudson Taylor once said, don't have your concert first and then tune your instrument afterwards. What if we began our days tuning our hearts to the heart of the Father before we did or said or posted or scrolled anything? And number 3, focus on relationship. It's easy to approach prayer with kind of a checklist, but I think Jesus is inviting us to something much deeper. When you pray, focus first on who God is. Start with gratitude. By centering your prayers on God first, you'll find that your perspective shifts. Instead of focusing on what you need, you'll be reminded first of who he is, and that changes everything. And I'm going to say this as clearly as I can. The aim isn't the things of God, but God himself. That's the aim of prayer, not to get his goodies, not to get his stuff, not even to get his blessings. The aim isn't the things of God, but God himself. If you're struggling, tell God. He can handle your doubts, your fears, and frustrations. If you're unsure where to start, remember that even help is a complete prayer. Prayer isn't about getting the words right. It's about bringing your whole self to God. And as Jesus reminds us, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. In fact, here's a practical challenge for us. What if just every day for the rest of this series, we just prayed the Lord's Prayer at some point throughout the day? And don't just rifle through it. Like, meditate on each line, on each word. What does this mean for me today? What if we just prayed the Lord's Prayer sometime every day for the next 5 weeks? What might that do to our hearts? Many will ask, why is prayer necessary? The truth is, we don't need prayer. If all we plan to do is sort of watch TV and scroll on our phones, to live life for ourselves, if all I'm doing is focusing on me and mine, you really don't need prayer. But church, if we want to shake the gates of hell and live lives transformed, lives of mission and purpose and calling, bringing light to dark places, bringing the gospel to every table, that's gonna take a lifetime of prayer, of being with God day in and day out. I want us to live lives so bold that it forces us to pray. We're not just praying in moments of desperation. I want us to feel that desperation all the time for his presence and his power. Imagine if we as a church embraced that kind of prayer. Imagine the kind of peace and power and intimacy with God we would experience. Imagine the impact it would have on those around us. As Richard Foster once said, if we truly love people, we will desire for them far more than it is within our power to give them, and this will lead us to prayer. Just to say it again, this series is not about becoming better at prayer. It's about intimacy with God. It's about learning to approach God as Jesus did, not as a distant deity, but as a loving Father. Because my friends, knowing the recipe can't hold a candle to enjoying the meal. Many of us have been studying the recipe our entire lives, and we know a lot about God and a lot about prayer. This is an invitation to know him as Father. I want you to imagine a life saturated in the love of God, moving from craving love from others to resting in God's love for you. Moving from impatience and stress to recognizing God's presence at work in your life. Moving from finding worth in doing to confidence in our being in Christ. A place where it's not about how useful prayer is to us. The aim is less about mastery and more about intimacy. What if prayer wasn't something we dreaded but we desired? What if it wasn't just a discipline, but it's something that we delighted in? What if we didn't just say to each other, oh, I'll pray for you, but we stopped and actually did it right then and there? What if we became a people of prayer? Recognizing and remembering that prayer is an invitation from a loving Father. This week, let's take that first step. Maybe our prayer this week is simply to God, God, what do you want to do together? And it's my hope and it is my conviction that the Lord will begin to do something in us and through us as a community that will send ripples into eternity. I believe marriages will be restored. Families forever changed. Communities will find the light of the gospel, to find freedom from sin and shame and death. What if we became a people who recognized our utter dependence on God every single breath of every single day? I think that would change everything. At the very least, it would change us.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel today. I hope that you felt the welcome home of Christ right through your screen. Here we believe that the gospel is good news worth sharing. So if you'd like to share this stream with your friends and family, you can also subscribe to this channel and you can use @BridgeChurchTN. Also, if you'd like to give, there's a link in the description there you can click and it'll walk you through all the steps. And if you'd like to stay connected with us, you can simply head on over to bridge.tv. Hope to see you again soon.